Zoom presentation. The presentation would be the same, but questions may vary between the different regions and a mix of people. So before I hand over to Brandon to start his presentation, does anyone have any other questions? Nothing on the floor so far. How about chat? Do we have any questions in chat? Okay, Brandon.
Thank you for the introduction, Narissa. So as I have on my screen here, there is a slight change to the agenda. For the first time during the 2022 CGP Roadshow, my colleague Matt Shimizu at State Water Board will be providing kind of a glimpse into the new smarts screens for submitting your notice of intent for the 2022 permit. So that will be following my presentation, and then we'll move on to the break after his. And so altogether, I think will probably be just over an hour or so of content. So I wanted to start this meeting with the California Water Board's mission. And our mission is to preserve, enhance, and restore California's water resources for the benefit of present and future generations. Our boards conduct our work through a process to strengthen and empower our community voices as we work together to provide clean, safe, and affordable water to all Californians. The purpose of today's workshop is to offer the dischargers, municipalities, and stormwater professionals and other interested parties with a high-level overview of the 2022 construction stormwater general permit requirements. And then also provide an opportunity for you to meet your regulators. It's always good to talk to the folks that are out there with the boots on the ground implementing the requirements of this permit. And so state and regional water board staff will share their expectations for implementing the new permit requirements, and then answer any questions to the best of our abilities. This workshop is being offered both in person and virtually, and so staff will prioritize answering questions from the in-person attendees. And then please wait to ask your question until we provide you a microphone. That way the attendees that are joining us online can also hear your question. And that way it also gets recorded as well. And then virtual attendees can submit their questions in the chat, and then we'll have our staff here either answering them in chat, or we can ask them in front of the room and reiterate those responses as well. So as Narissa mentioned, the presentation that I'm delivering today, as well as Matt's presentation, will be made available online at the Construction Stormwater General Permit webpage. However, we do have to make those accessible first, so it will take a little bit of time for us to get those posted. I'm thinking probably mid-August is when we'll get that online, as well as the workshop recording as well. And then for future updates, please consider joining our Gov Delivery listserv on the Water Board's website under the Stormwater Construction Permitting Issues tab. Okay, so this is a joke. I wanted to start off the presentation with something light, and this was submitted by Molly Dimmick. Why are erosion BMPs important? Because they really improve runoff at your site. I know all the jokes that were submitted were very cheesy. So, but that's stormwater for you. And with that joke aside, let's move on to the requirement overview. So just to break down this presentation, I'm going to provide a little bit of background on the MPDS Construction Stormwater General Permit, and then move on into the requirements before getting into the question and answer session, but we'll have Matt's presentation in there as well. So let's begin this presentation with some construction stormwater permitting context. The Federal Clean Water Act prohibits certain discharges of stormwater to waters of the United States, except those that comply with a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. The Construction Stormwater General Permit is a specific MPDS permit that regulates discharges of runoff generated by precipitation over construction sites and other areas of active land disturbance. The State Water Resources Control Board adopted the previous permit in 2009 to regulate stormwater discharges associated with construction activities disturbing one or more acres of land. The 2009 Construction Stormwater General Permit expired on September 2nd of 2014 and has since been administratively extended. The 2022 CGP serves to implement new regulatory requirements such as the federal effluent limitation guidelines, statewide policies, and total maximum daily loads that became effective since the adoption of the 2009 permit. This slide portrays important dates when it comes to implementing the requirements of the 2022 CGP. To start, the State Water Board adopted the 2022 CGP on September 8th of 2022, so solidifying the requirements drafted through an extensive public process. One of those provisions was to provide statewide programmatic permitting as an option to dischargers implementing the Executive Order N720 to provide high-speed broadband internet access to rural communities, and we had to do that by December 17th of 2022. To meet the ambitious goals set by the executive order. Yeah, go ahead and mute. Okay. During the adoption meeting, the State Water Board determines that September 1st, 2023 was a reasonable date for the permit to become effective, allowing for State Water Board staff to develop guidance, host these workshops, and update smarts. September 1st, 2023 also initiates the 2-year regulatory transition period where dischargers with existing coverage under the 2009 permit can continue that coverage until August 31st, 2025. On September 1st, 2025, all remaining projects will be administratively terminated and will need to reapply for permit coverage under the 2022 permit to continue their construction activities. Existing dischargers that wish to transfer coverage from their 2009 permit to the 2022 permit may do so by submitting a notice of termination after obtaining coverage under the 2022 permit. One thing to note are that changes of information to increase acreage under the 2009 permit will not be approved during the regulatory transition period. The new acreage must be covered under the 2022 permit. Additionally, waivers granted under the 2009 permit cannot be modified or extended during this regulatory transition period. So with that context in mind, let's move on to the requirements of the 2022 CGP. This table shows a list of permit requirements that we'll be covering today. I tried to structure the presentation within a logical order based on the permitting process. So we'll start with some of the more administrative aspects when you're enrolling for permit coverage, and then move into monitoring, as well as discussing some of the new attachments which apply to specific dischargers before additional administrative requirements such as the notice of termination and changes of information. So first, let's discuss which projects require permit coverage. Not much has changed here. Projects that disturb 1 or more acres of land or are less than 1 acre but are part of a larger common plan of development require permit coverage. Projects that were planned together but are separated by 1/4 of a mile are not considered part of a larger common plan of development. As with the 2009 permit, there are some differences between the traditional and linear construction projects in terms of the requirements that they comply with. So I just wanted to note that here. And then the application will include, or the notice of intent will include permit registration documents such as site drawings and maps, the stormwater pollution prevention plan, applicable post-construction plans and calculations, and then the first annual fee based on disturbed acreage. So pretty similar to the 2009 permit. For the post-construction plan submittals, there have been a few changes. Still, linear underground and overhead projects are not required to submit their post-construction plans. They're exempt from those requirements. Dischargers that are complying with a city or county post-construction requirement are required to submit with their permit application an attachment or web source that's containing the applicable requirements that you are complying with, and then the preliminary or approved post-construction plans and calculations. If the discharger submitted preliminary plans, they must submit the final plans within 14 days of receiving approval from the MS4, whether that be the city or the county. Dischargers complying with the 2022 CGP's post-construction requirements are required to submit their post-construction plans and calculations with their permit application as well. And that's done through the calculator in SMARTS. And then the regional water board staff may review and request revisions if necessary for those complying with the 2022 permit. The 2022 permit also provides region-wide programmatic permitting. so that dischargers can cover multiple non-contiguous linear projects under a single WDID within a given region. So in order to qualify for this, you have to be a linear project for one, and then you have to be located within a single regional water board jurisdiction, be a group of projects with similar scopes and common construction activities, and have the same legally responsible person. And so part of applying for programmatic permitting coverage is what's called a common stormwater pollution prevention plan. And this details all of the best management practices and the monitoring schemes that would apply to all of these sites covered within this regional programmatic permitting. And then in order to add acreage under this, you would have to submit a linear construction activity notification to have your additional projects covered under the same WDID. All right. The 2022 CGP includes a provision for property owners to submit a notice of non-applicability, which essentially means that the project is located in a basin or watershed that is not hydrologically connected to waters of the United States, or in other words, does not have the potential to discharge to waters of the United States. An example that comes to mind for applicable watersheds would be the Lancaster-Palmdale region of California. Oh, let me go back one step. Okay, sorry. This option is only available to dischargers when the site is not hydrologically connected to waters of the United States. So this means that relying on a constructed basin to capture stormwater is not a sufficient justification for applying for the notice of non-applicability, as basins can fail and result in discharge to waters of the United States. In some limited instances, a project that is being built in a location that was previously altered to such a degree that stormwater runoff will never discharge to waters of the United States, the Regional Water Board may find that a notice of non-applicability is acceptable. I'm thinking of some rare cases here, but one project that came to mind was a construction project within an abandoned quarry. And so like there was basically a giant pit in the ground and had no waters of the United States that ran through. So if you have any questions regarding the notice of non-applicability, I recommend contacting the Regional Water Board staff to see if your site is eligible. If the project meets the criteria, a California licensed engineer or geologist with hydrological expertise must prepare a site-specific no discharge technical report and as part of the NONA application. And once all of that is submitted, you'll be issued a notice of non-applicability ID, and the regional water boards can determine whether or not they agree with that at a later date. All right, in this next section of the presentation, we'll discuss new roles for the qualified SWIP developers and practitioners, qualifying precipitation events, and other monitoring requirements. So qualified SWIP developer and practitioner responsibilities. Qualified SWIP developers are required to prepare the site-specific stormwater pollution prevention plan and conduct inspections. So their inspections are going to be required at the start of construction, when a QSD has been replaced, twice annually, and then following a numeric action level exceedance. Qualified SWIP practitioners oversee monitoring and implementation of the stormwater pollution prevention plan and conduct inspections once per month prior to qualifying precipitation events, following a numeric action level exceedance, and then for the notice of termination. The 2022 permit also allows the water boards to suspend or rescind qualified SWIP developer or practitioner certifications as an enforcement action. But I do want you guys to know that this would be a more of a progressive kind of enforcement. So if we find that a qualified SWIP developer or practitioner is negligent or not very competent in their role, we probably seek to have them do additional training before moving to rescind their certification. If it continues, then rescission will be on the table. All right, stormwater professional training. The construction general permit training team has been revising the QSD QSP training program curricula to include content on the 2022 CGP. And that's because we still are actually planning to teach on the 2009 permit for the regulatory transition period. Some new QSDs and QSPs may be working on those sites that are complying with the old permit requirements. And so our thought process there is that we'll just include some of the new requirements, and then we'll release a separate training that they can go through to get a good review of those requirements. And that should be coming out soon. The qualified SWIP developers and practitioners certified through the California Stormwater Quality Association are required to complete 6 hours of continuing education annually. And this can be done through a variety of vendors. It could also be done as part of a lot of the underlying prerequisites that these certifications require to get the QSD or QSP certification. And so there's double dipping allowed. State Water Board staff have also considered or are considering recommendations for additional QSD, QSP prerequisite training courses. And the process there would be that the construction general permit training team will help us review to see if these courses are aligned with the kind of like the criteria that were set forth back for the 2009 permit. And then we'll make that recommendation to the State Water Board's Division of Water Quality Deputy Director, and we'll have that essentially added as an option for those pursuing QSDs and QSP certifications. And then lastly, QSPs opting to delegate responsibilities have to provide training. It's also set by the Construction General Permit Training Team. And basically, they're going to be providing some foundational trainings, which cover how to communicate with the qualified SWIP practitioner, how to report inspections and findings, as well as how to locate a forecast for the particular site. And then depending on their actual responsibilities, there'd be more site-specific training based on whether they are inspecting, whether they're implementing the best management practices, or whether they're monitoring the stormwater. And if they're doing all three, they would have to have training on all three. And that was more of a move because over the life of the 2009 permit, we saw a lot of trained delegates that weren't really doing their roles properly. So we're hoping that this requirement will kind of beef their competency up. All right, now the fun part. Let's talk about the qualifying precipitation event definition. So per the 2022 CGP glossary, a qualifying precipitation event is any weather pattern that is forecast to have a 50% or greater probability of precipitation and a quantitative precipitation forecast of 1/2 inch or more within a 24-hour period. The event begins with the 24-hour period where 1/2 inch has been forecast and will continue on subsequent 24-hour periods when 1/4 of an inch or more is of precipitation is forecast. So my preferred method for acquiring forecasts is to use the National Weather Service forecast weather table interface. The 2022 CGP risk issuance review prepared by the Construction General Permit Training Team details how to access these forecasts for specific sites through this method. And actually, one of the benefits that I really appreciate about this approach is that you're able to bookmark specific sites in your web browser. And then it makes it relatively quick to just pull your forecast for the day just by clicking on your bookmark. So now this table is a little hard to read on the screen. So I pulled some examples to share my recommended approach in determining what a qualifying precipitation is with you today. So here is an example of 2 qualifying precipitation events that came around New Year's in Sacramento. Note that the weather table interface breaks days into 4 6-hour blocks. My first recommendation is to look for a probability of precipitation of 50% or greater in one of those 6-hour blocks. From there, we totaled the quantitative precipitation forecast to see if it's 1/2 inch or greater. If it is, then that would be a qualifying precipitation event. So for the first qualifying precipitation event on December 31st, the 4 a.m. block indicates that there is a probability of precipitation of 55%. The total quantitative precipitation forecast for that 24-hour period is over 1 inch. The next day does not have 1/4 of an inch of precipitation forecast, so the qualifying precipitation event ends on December 31st. Note that when determining if it's going to be a multi-day qualifying precipitation event, we no longer consider the probability of precipitation and just look at the quantitative precipitation forecast. If we look at the 4 p.m. block on January 2nd, we see that there was a 50% probability of precipitation. However, the quantitative precipitation forecast is less than 1/2 inch and is therefore not a qualifying precipitation event. Looking at the 4 p.m. block on January 4th, we see that the probability of precipitation is greater than 50%, and there was a quantitative precipitation forecast of greater than 1 inch for that 24-hour period. And then the subsequent 24-hour period has greater than 1/4 of an inch of precipitation forecast and would therefore continue the event. By 4 p.m. on January 6th, there is no longer 1/4 of an inch forecast, indicating that the event ends by the 10 a.m. block of January 6th. And here's the second example I've pulled for you today, and it's basically showing a 6-day qualifying precipitation event. I don't expect this to be the typical qualifying precipitation event, but as we all know, last rainy season was anything but typical. All right, let's move on to site inspections. So similar to the 2009 permit, the 2022 permit requires weekly site inspections to ensure that best management practices are properly implemented and functioning appropriately. Excuse me. All dischargers are required to conduct pre, during, and post-qualifying precipitation event inspections, any of which could also count towards the weekly and monthly inspections. In the 2022 permit, the QSP is required to conduct the pre-storm inspection, as their expertise would lend well to any needed corrective actions. Acknowledging that the QSP may have several sites under their watch, QSPs now have an extended range to conduct their pre-storm inspections, up to 120 hours in advance if you have forecasted available, or a forecast available extending that long. And this allows for more flexible planning for the QSPs. Now, considering that the pre-storm inspections are based on forecasts, which are subject to change prior to the start of the actual precipitation event, we recommend that QSPs and trained delegates save the forecast they use to base their inspection decisions on. While pre-inspections are based on forecasts, post-inspections are still based on actual site precipitation data collected through an on-site rain gauge. If 1/2 inch or more was recorded during the qualifying precipitation event, the QSP or trained delegate is required to do the post-inspection within 96 hours of the end of the event. And so that's another extension. It used to be 48 hours, allowing for more flexibility in planning. Now would be a good time to note that weekly, pre, during, and post-inspections are not required outside of scheduled site operating hours, when the site is not accessible to personnel, or when there is dangerous weather conditions such as electrical storms, flooding, and then high winds over 40 miles per hour. That's a new one. All right. So that's a lot of different inspections to be aware of. To simplify it, I've created a table that shows which stormwater professionals can perform each type of inspection. It lists weekly, pre-precipitation event, during precipitation event, post-precipitation event, the inactive project inspection requirements, the monthly inspection requirements, and then also the qualified SWIP developer and practitioner specific requirements for the annual site inspections, replacing QSDs prior to a notice of termination, and then exceedances as well. Okay. Stormwater discharge monitoring. Risk level 1 dischargers are still not required to sample stormwater discharges for pH and turbidity like the risk level 2 and 3 dischargers do. Risk level 2 and 3 dischargers are required to obtain 1 sample from each of the actively discharging locations per 24-hour period of a qualifying precipitation event. Risk level 2 and 3 dischargers shall use their calibrated field meters to analyze the stormwater for pH and turbidity. And then since only 1 sample is required per 24-hour period, there is no, per discharge location, there is no daily averaging per discharge location or site. This permit also focuses or emphasizes the non-visible pollutant monitoring requirements, which were also part of the 2009 permit. Non-visible pollutant monitoring is required for all dischargers, including risk level 1, only when there is a pollutant that may be discharged due to a failure to implement best management practices, a container spill or leak, or best management practice breach, failure, or malfunction. Dischargers must collect at least 1 sample each 24-hour period until necessary corrective actions are completed. Dischargers are not required to sample if the corrective actions are completed before a discharge occurs. That's an important note. All right, next we'll move into attachments F through J, which present requirements for discharges with specific activities or within specific watersheds. I'm going to start a little bit out of order because this is probably the one that's on everyone's mind, starting with attachment H, which addresses total maximum daily load implementation requirements, since some of these requirements are related to the permits monitoring requirements that we just discussed. A total maximum daily load is an existing regulation that the Regional Water Board or US EPA adopts into the Regional Water Board's Water Quality Control Plan, otherwise known as a basin plan. Total maximum daily loads address pollutants that cause impairments to water bodies by establishing a sum of allowable pollutant loads into specific water bodies or watersheds from all identified sources of that specific pollutant. Total maximum daily loads are existing regulations that are incorporated into the Regional Water Board, or I guess I already talked about that. Let's see. Total maximum daily loads address pollutants that cause impairments to water bodies by establishing a sum of allowable pollutant loading from their identified sources, but they are not self-implementing and are implemented through the requirements adopted in permit orders, such as an MPDS construction stormwater general permit. MPDS dischargers are considered point sources of pollutants and are occasionally assigned what's called a waste load allocation through a total maximum daily load to limit the discharge of that pollutant. The 2022 CGP refers to dischargers in watersheds or water bodies that are addressed with a TMDL. And then they also have if they also have the potential to discharge the TMDL related pollutant, they are called responsible dischargers. Responsible dischargers may have to comply with one or more of the four categories of TMDL implementation requirements. The first is just simply complying with the permit requirements, where that is sufficient to address the TMDL. And this is required for all dischargers anyways. The second is using the revised universal soil loss equation, version 2, which is an erosion modeling software to determine which erosion and sediment control best management practices will be used to reduce the sediment loading to comply with the waste load allocation. And then lastly, there are numeric action levels and numeric effluent limitations where the responsible discharger must assess their discharge through the non-visible pollutant monitoring requirements that we reviewed previously. So this is kind of what we envision in terms of how the TMDL implementation is going to work. So step one, the discharger has to determine their responsible discharge status. Are they in a watershed or discharging to a water body with a total maximum daily load? Next, they would perform a site-specific pollutant source assessment and determine if they even have that pollutant that the TMDL is addressing on their site. If they don't, they're not a responsible discharger. If they do, they would have to refer to attachment H for the specific implementation requirements for that. And this image here is actually a sneak peek of the total maximum daily load mapping tool that our staff are preparing and planning on releasing soon. So in the event that the discharger has to comply with a total maximum daily load related numeric action level or numeric effluent limitation, the discharger would assess their discharges through the non-visible pollutant monitoring. All three of the following conditions need to be met in order for the TMDL sampling to be triggered. If any condition is not met, then TMDL sampling is not required. So first, the construction project has to discharge to a TMDL listed watershed or water body. Second, their pollutant source assessment has to identify that a TMDL specific pollutant with a waste load allocation that was translated into a numeric action level or numeric effluent limitation has the potential to be discharged from the site. And then third, the non-visible pollutant sampling must be triggered. Non-visible pollutant sampling is triggered when there is a failure to implement best management practices, a container that spilled or leaked, and then if there's been a best management practice breach or failure. If the spill, leak, or breach is not fixed and cleaned, and the best management practices are not implemented prior to discharge, then non-visible sampling is required. However, like I said before, if you do your corrective actions to clean up the spill, leak, or breach, and the best management practices are in place prior to discharge, the non-visible pollutant sampling would not be required. That said, a TMDL-related numeric action level and numeric effluent limitation cannot be exceeded with just a single sampling point. Steps 1 through 3 must occur again with multiple samples above the numeric action level or numeric effluent limitation, and they have to be from the same drainage area and during the same reporting year to be considered an exceedance. Exceedances of numeric action levels require that the discharger implement iterative corrective actions, while exceedances of numeric effluent limitations are violations of the permit and subject to mandatory minimum penalties. All right, we'll move on to active treatment systems now, which is attachment F, and it provides the requirements for the use of the active treatment systems and is not new, but has had a few key changes compared to the 2009 permit. So there is now a pH numeric effluent limitation in addition to the previous permit's turbidity and residual chemical effluent limitations. Dischargers are now allowed to actually bypass the active treatment systems if the discharge complies with the permit's applicable numeric action levels, numeric effluent limitations, and receiving water limitations. So that's an important one. During the 2009 permit, there was a lot of confusion about whether you could bypass an active treatment systems, and most regional water boards actually said, no, you can't. You have to use the active treatment system, which ended up being costly for a lot of dischargers. Dischargers are still required to have staff monitor the active treatment system, but they don't necessarily have to be on-site staff. You can now use remote staff as long as they can safely shut down the system should it not be operating correctly. And then the discharger is required to upload their active treatment plan in SMARTS at least 14 days prior to the initiation or operation of the active treatment system. Although active treatment was included in the 2009 permit, it lacked any requirements for the use of passive treatment, chemicals or products, which are found in attachment G of the 2022 permit. First and foremost, applying the passive treatment products directly to receiving waters is strictly prohibited. Dischargers should be designing a treatment area within their site when using passive treatment. Furthermore, attachment G provides criteria for acceptable passive treatment chemicals, such as being non-cationic, being food grade, and then also providing a range of charge densities and molecular weights that are acceptable. It's also important to note that passive treatment is not to be used as a standalone best management practice. It needs to be used in conjunction with erosion and sediment controls to capture any of those solids that are settling out of the stream. And then as with the active treatment plan, the discharger must submit a QSD prepared passive treatment plan through SMARTS at least 14 days prior to applying these products. All right, now we're going to talk about exceptions to the California Ocean Plan. The 2022 CGP includes an attachment I containing requirements for construction stormwater discharges to areas of special biological significance, also known as ASBS. Construction stormwater discharges to ASBS are prohibited unless the State Water Board first provides an exception to the California Ocean Plan for that specific discharger. And for a little bit of background, the California Ocean Plan is basically a basin plan, but it applies statewide for with the receiving water being the ocean. Attachment I requires that the discharge or the discharger prepare an ASBS compliance plan, which incorporates the core discharge monitoring and receiving water monitoring requirements of the ocean plan. Core discharge monitoring may include parameters such as total suspended solids, turbidity, pH, pesticides, metals, nutrients, and indicator bacteria. The ocean receiving water monitoring can also be done either on an individual basis or through a regional integrated program. If a discharger produces a sampling result demonstrating that the stormwater discharge caused or contributed to an alteration of the natural ocean water quality, they are required to submit a report to the State Water Board within 30 days. All right. The requirements in attachment J apply to dischargers that are subject to that are not subject to a separate MPDS permit for their dewatering activities. Dewatering is defined as mechanical pumping or siphoning of non-potable water from excavations, foundations, vaults, impoundments, and groundwater removal specifically related to construction activities. Dewatering discharges must comply with the pH and turbidity numeric action levels, which are for pH is a range between 6.5 to 8.5, and then for turbidity is 250 NTUs. Dischargers may not dewater in areas that are where there is known soil or groundwater contamination that can cause pollution or nuisance. And then dischargers shall notify the regional water board 24 hours prior to an anticipated dewatering discharge. And that can just be done by shooting an email to the applicable regional water board's stormwater email. Okay, so this is kind of a random slide, I guess you could say. So while surface water buffer requirements are not in their own attachment, I did want to touch upon them because they are a new minimum best management practice that was or a requirement promulgated by the U.S. EPA's Construction and Development Effluent Limitation Guidelines. Essentially, the dischargers are required to provide and maintain natural buffers and or equivalent erosion and sediment controls when a waters of United States is located within 50 feet of the site's earth disturbances, unless that is infeasible. So the surface water buffer requirements apply to work above the top of bank or high water level of waters of United States, work within channels, stream beds, or Clean Water Act 404 projects and 401 certified projects are actually exempt from these requirements, as well as projects where there are no natural surface buffers, thinking like a LA River channelized type situation. The discharger may use the Russell 2 or another regional water board approved method to demonstrate that the erosion and sediment controls are equivalent to the natural 50-foot buffer, if that is the option that they are going with. All right. As mentioned earlier, these last few slides will discuss new requirements for revising permit coverage and terminating permit coverage. This table displays where the 2022 permits change of information process differs from the 2009 permit. For the most part, it is actually the same, but we are no longer requiring that updates to the stormwater pollution prevention plans and site maps must be submitted through a change of information. However, final post-construction plans and changing a project to inactive status will require a discharger to submit a change of information. So what are projects with inactive status? So the 2022 permit allows dischargers to file a change of information to switch to inactive status, which allows dischargers to reduce their monitoring when there is no active construction. The change of information will require a revised site map and photos of any temporary stabilization that was put in place for that inactive period. The discharger will still have to do monthly inspections if the site is accessible, and pre-qualifying precipitation event inspections will also be required, though either the QSP or the trained delegate can actually do those inspections. One thing to note is that inactive projects are maintaining permit coverage and therefore are still subject to the annual permit fee. The permit also incorporates a provision for dischargers, primarily large housing developers, to terminate residential lots that have unfinished yard and landscaping areas. In order to reduce acreage, the dischargers must meet the following criteria. The residential lot has been sold to an individual homeowner for residential use, and a certificate of occupancy or equivalent document is maintained at the home or on site. The lot has to be less than 1 acre of disturbance. All construction activity conducted on the lot by the discharger has to be completed, and the discharger has had to have installed temporary best management practices to stabilize the unfinished yard and landscaping areas. And then the discharger has to upload as an attachment to SMARTS documentation of a contract, such as a covenants, conditions, and restrictions, or CC&Rs, requiring the individual owner to stabilize their yard and landscaping areas within 1 year of moving in and to maintain temporary best management practices until stabilization is met. All right, and then lastly, we'll do the notice of termination. So the notice of termination process requires that a qualified stormwater pollution prevention plan practitioner conduct a notice of termination final inspection. The discharger has to submit photos demonstrating the final stabilization, and as well as photos of the post-construction best management practices that are in place. The discharger has to submit a final site map that details those completed construction features and the permanent erosion and sediment control best management practices. And then the photos would be oriented on that map to allow the regional water board staff reviewing that notice of termination to understand what they're looking at from their desk. The discharger also has to include a long-term maintenance plan for the post-construction best management practices. And this is as simple as just saying, here are the post-construction controls that are in place. The tenant is taking over control of maintaining those, and this is how frequently they are going to maintain them. So nothing too crazy there. And that's actually an existing requirement that has long gone kind of ignored. So a new provision is that the notice of termination will be approved if the regional water board does not deny, return, or accept that notice of termination for review within 30 days. So depending on the amount of notice of terminations, there might be a prioritization of which ones they do accept for review and which ones they'll let lapse with the 30 days. And with that, we'll go ahead and move on to Matt Shimizu's presentation on the new smart screens. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing, Matt.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay. So, can you guys see my screen right now?
We're looking at your PowerPoint in general. It's not the display.
Slideshow.
And now we're looking at your speaker notes.
Oh, okay.
So if you go to display settings up there, you can switch it to. Oh.
Hold on. Sorry. Let me stop sharing real quick. I'm gonna share my other screen. Sorry about that.
Celebrity, huh?
Okay. Can you see my screen now?
It's still showing us. Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Perfect. Oh,
And then we hear you loud and clear as well.
Okay, perfect. I don't know if I could turn my camera on, but we'll do that later. So hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Shimizu. I'm an environmental scientist in the Industrial and Construction Stormwater Unit. I am the current Industrial and Construction Smarts lead, and I recently took over for Patrick Osuji in that capacity. And today I'm going to be giving you a presentation on some of the new smarts enhancements that we are looking to include specifically for the construction notice of intent. And okay, and so starting from here, so in this presentation, as I said, I plan on discussing the revised notice of intent application process and provide some of the updates that we recently added into smarts for the reissued 2022 construction stormwater general permit. Since the notice of intent application contains tabs and functions that other applications have, I decided to simply present on the notice of intent today so it can capture everything. And then just as a side note, we will be releasing all updates and changes made into smarts for the 2022 CGP on September 1st, 2023, with the few exception items such as adding a little bit more things or functionality to the COI, NOT, and then some further enhancements for the inspections, violations, and enforcement actions tab, which specifically pertain to internal users. Okay, and so this slide is basically going to tell us how we would create a notice of intent. Just a brief overview. So the first action we would need to do is from the main menu of the user's account. We would go to the Start a New Application dropdown, select the construction permits, and then select the statewide construction option, and that's listed right here. Okay, from there, the user can then either create a new organization, or they can link the application to an existing organization if if that user is already associated and linked to that organization. So that screen is what this organization selection is right here. As you can see, you have the option to create a new organization, or you can link the application to an existing organization that you're already linked to. From there, the user can then either add or delink other users to the application, and then that will confirm. So as you can see here, myself and Alex are the only individuals currently linked to the organization that I selected right here. And I can add either other LRP, an additional LRP, other duly authorized representatives, or data entry persons. And then once this all looks correct, I would hit the confirm and create application button and then be placed in the pre-application screen. And so basically, once these steps have been completed, the user will be placed back, or will be placed into the pre-application question section. Users will then move through all the tabs and complete the application. And then finally, either the LRP, the legally responsible person, or the duly authorized representative will certify and submit that application in for state board's review. Okay, and then as discussed, so this is the pre-application question screen right here. This is a new functionality that we recently added, and its purpose was to help dischargers select the correct application type that they're applying for. So as you can see, when hovering over the three available application types, so right, the notice of intent, erosivity waiver, and notice of non-applicability, it will provide the user with a general description of the application type and provide some general requirements as well, just to kind of help you determine what application is best applicable for your site. And then, as I stated, this the purpose of this was to help the discharger select the correct application type. It kind of helps them determine their application eligibility, and then it will also place them into the correct interface, such as the traditional or linear interface, based on the type of construction selected in that first question. And then users can switch. So users can actually switch between different application types at any time. So if they are, let's say they select NOI, they go through this process, and before hitting the create application button, let's say, oh, maybe I want to apply for the erosivity waiver, they can click that erosivity waiver option at the top, and it will place them into the erosivity waivers pre-application questions. Same for the notice of non-applicability, and you can go back and forth as many times as you like. But I'd like to preface and say that once you hit that create application button, the application will be created and the user cannot change the application from within. So if you were in like a traditional NOI and you needed a linear NOI, you would need to actually delete the application and restart this process again. Same with if you started an NOI but wanted a waiver or a NONA, or vice versa, you would need to delete the application and then restart this quick process over again. And then finally, some of the answers from this pre-application section will be placed and automatically filled in the application once you confirm later on. Okay, and so basically what I'm going to be discussing now, I'm going to just show some screenshots of the new screen interface and kind of discuss what's changed between the 2009 CGP and the 2022 CGP in regards to the NOI's tabs and their fields. And so the first tab is, of course, the owner information tab. And with this, there were no changes between the 2009 CGP and the 2022 CGP for this tab, and all fields and functionality remain the same. Okay, moving forward, This tab was previously known as the Developer Information tab, and it has since been updated to the On-Site Contact Information tab. But other than that, all other fields and functionality with this tab remain the same between the 2009 and 2022 CGP. Okay, moving forward. So we have the Site Information tab here. And staff added 2 new fields, which are listed in red above, and those are the total planned disturbed acreage and the disturbed area remaining. The total planned disturbed acreage helps determine how much the project plans to disturb, and then the disturbed area remaining kind of helps determine fees, pricing, and whatnot. So you can see what's actually being disturbed. From there, we also remove the imperviousness before construction and the imperviousness after construction fields from this tab. And we move those into the post-construction tab that I'll discuss later on in my presentation. And then, as I mentioned from my pre-application part, since some of those questions automatically fill in the application, for the NOI specific, for the traditional NOI specifically, we have, as you can see in the bottom red box, we have is the site a part of a larger common plan of development? And it's 2 other questions. And the type of construction are going to be filled based on whatever you entered in the pre-application questions. And as you can see right here, we do lock the type of construction section because, as I stated, we don't want users to switch back and forth between traditional and linear, because that can cause issues with smarts and whatnot. So once you're in a traditional NOI, you're in a traditional. If you need a linear, you'll need to delete and then start the application process over. Moving forward, so we have the additional site information tab. We have, as you can see, we've added a good amount of new fields, but we've also removed some as well. So this tab added the following questions and fields. So we added the county field. We moved that from the site info tab. The regional board field, which we also moved from the site info tab. And then we added the regional board email field, a dewatering question, an active treatment systems question, a passive treatment technologies question, an areas of special biological significance question, and then we also, from this tab, remove the name of local agency field, the phone number of that local agency field. We remove the does the stormwater runoff from the construction site discharge to question. And then we also remove the QSD field, as we have since created its own tab, which I will discuss later in my presentation. Okay, so with the risk, I have it kind of split up into 3 different tabs, but there have actually been no changes made between the 2009 CGP and the 2022 CGP for this risk tab. So everything remains the same, but I'll just give you a quick overlook of what the new screens look like, but everything works as it does currently. Okay, so now let's discuss the total maximum daily load, or TMDL tab. So the total maximum daily loads are a new provision incorporated during the 2022 CGP reissuance, and is now a new tab in SMARTS for construction. Similar to the industrial general permit, one of my colleagues and staff, Reed Hoshovsky, he actually created an impaired water body watershed mapping tool specifically for construction TMDLs. And so I'm going to give you a quick breakdown of the TMDL process. So the first step is to use the external TMDL mapping tool. At the very top of the screen, you can see there's like that little hyperlink TMDL map tool at the top. You'll want to click on that. enter in the project's coordinates, and then see if the mapping tool spits out any impaired water bodies or watersheds. If the mapping tool does list some impaired water bodies or watersheds, you'll want to mark yes for that first question at the top. But if the tool does not list any impaired water bodies or watersheds, you would want to mark no for that first question at the top. And if you do select no for the first question at the top, you're done, and you can continue to the next tab or to the post-construction tab. But if you do select yes, then it is up to the discharger to select all of the impaired water bodies or watersheds that apply to that project. So for example, let's say the mapping tool provides you with 3 impaired water bodies or watersheds. The discharger doesn't necessarily need to select all 3. They can select 1 or 2. They just need to select what is applicable to their project. The mapping tool is not supposed to answer all of that for you. Okay, the third step is once you have then selected the impaired water bodies or watersheds from this drop down right here, and the drop down will contain all of the impaired water bodies and watersheds pertaining to your region, and that's going to be based on the lat long from the site info tab. Once the discharger has selected all of the applicable impaired water bodies or watersheds, all of their TMDL information will be listed in this first table right there. Okay, it'll have their the TMDL name, the impaired water body or watershed, the certain parameter that they tied to it, the compliance deadline, and then it'll have the column where it says present in construction site stormwater discharge. And so this is where discharge will need to either select yes or no. If they select yes, then they will be responsible for complying with that specific TMDL parameter. And as you can see, if you select yes, those specific TMDL requirements will be listed in a table below, so you kind of know what you need to comply with. And then if no, then the discharger is not responsible for complying with that TMDL pollutants requirements and does not need to comply with that. And then, as I stated, all of the applicable TMDL requirements will be listed at that bottom table. But once the application is approved, there is a requirements tab that's populated, and that will also show up in that requirements tab as well. So you'll have the TMDL requirements table essentially in 2 different places. Okay, so with post-construction, staff removed the following questions from these initial question section. So staff removed, will the project use an alternative method to calculate runoff volume or use different site design measures than those listed in the CGP calculator? We removed this question because dischargers, we only really want dischargers to use the smart CGP calculator when performing their post-construction calculations, because we want all of the calculations to be consistent for all construction dischargers. And then we also removed, does the phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 have an approved stormwater management plan that includes post-construction requirements? And we decided to remove this question because the stormwater management plan should already be included in the phase 1 or phase 2 MS4 post-construction plan and documentation. So as you can see on the screen, these are the only 2 questions that are currently asked for the initial questions section. Okay, and then from here we have the input and output section. So for the input section, we updated and added the following fields. So we updated the closest location to the closest rain gauge location. And we also updated size, parentheses acres, to size of drainage area, parentheses acres. And then, as I mentioned previously in my presentation, we added the imperviousness before and after construction fields in the pre-construction and post-construction input sections. And And we did this because we thought that it would be better suited in the post-construction rather than the site info tab. And these fields are also now being automatically generated based on the inputs for the pre-construction and post-construction values, rather than it being a manually entered value that it previously was on the site info tab. And as for the output section, all fields and functionality remain the same. This is just an automatic auto-generated field based on the inputs and or the credits used. And finally, we have the credits portion of the post-construction tab. So we added one new credit, which was the basins credit, as you can see right here. And we only asked really one question and asked for, or two questions. So we ask if the minimum drawdown times are included in the basins design and what the basins total capacity is. And then, just FYI, the first question must be a yes in order to receive any credit for the basins credit. Okay, moving forward, as I mentioned from the additional site info tab, we created a QSD information tab on its own. And so as you can see right here, so previously, dischargers would add a single QSD by going to the additional site info tab and then adding just one. However, we have since made it so the tab allows for multiple QSDs to be added to a single project, and that we can select a primary QSD as well. And so this is what you're seeing right here is kind of the search screen. You can search by their last name, first name, or their email address, and then you can link a specific QSD to your project. And then this is the table right here, as I mentioned. So let's just say Sean Naismith was the first person I selected. He will be automatically the primary QSD, and that primary QSD bubble will be automatically filled in. But once Erica, Amen Smitty's, once she is added as well, and there's two, you can switch between who you want delegated as your primary QSD. So it could be either Erica or Sean. And then this table will track all of the currently linked QSDs and then removed QSDs as well, and then when they were removed and added. Okay, so for the attachments tab, we included some new attachment files types, which include post-construction, passive/active treatment, risk calculations, TMDL/Russell 2, MS4 post-construction request, and then ASBS plan. And then we also made some minor edits to some of the file type names by placing correspondence in front of the title rather than having those as subtypes. But other than that, all other functionality with this tab remains the same as is between the 2009 and 2022 CGP. Okay, moving forward, so for the billing information tab, we included one new field, which is that disturbed area remaining field that I mentioned from the site info tab. And so this field is automatically populated and is locked and is based on the site info's field. And it can only be updated by submitting a COI for that site information tab's field. And this field was included per discharger's request to allow the dischargers to kind of estimate what their annual invoice fee will be. But other than that, other than adding the disturbed area remaining field, all other functionality remains the same for this tab. Okay, so we are now at the certification tab. And other than some minor text edits and, updating the punctuation, nothing has changed and the process still remains the same. So here is the not submitted screen for the discharger trying to submit. And then this is what the screen looks like upon submission. From there, we have the linked users tab, which of course, nothing changed from that. All functionality remains the same, just got a new refresh. And so that was the process of starting the application to submission. So from start to submission, but now we're going to kind of talk about what happens after the application is approved and you're issued that WDID. So as I mentioned previously, the requirements tab populates once the WDID is issued. And we updated and added the following requirements. So we updated the current requirements table to reflect as general requirements. So that top table was previously known as the current requirements, but is now known as the general requirements. We also updated some of the column headers within this tab as well, but I'm not going to, there's too much to talk about, so I'm not going to get into that. And then we also added a TMDL requirements table to display all of the TMDL parameters that the discharger must comply with. And that's going to be listed right here. So you'll find this table here and in the TMDL tab. Sorry. Okay, moving forward, we are now on the reports tab. This tab now displays both the annual and ad hoc reports in the same table. So as you can see on the screen, you can see both the annual and the ad hocs in simply one table. Previously, the reports tab only displayed the NOI's annual report, and users had to go into that specific annual report to view any of the associated ad hoc reports. But now you'll kind of just be able to go into the ad hoc reports directly from that reports tab. That's pretty much it. We've changed for this reports tab. Moving forward, so for the inspections, violations, and enforcement actions tab, it's currently what we have going on. It applies to all three, so I'm going to give this kind of generally. But at this time, for dischargers and external users, the inspections, violations, and enforcement actions tab will only display the table shown here. So it'll only display these three tables. And will only allow the dischargers and other external users to review the specific information within the PDF summary. So in the red, you'll see that's where they can see the more in-depth information. They won't at this time be able to click on the inspection ID or the violation ID or the enforcement ID within Smarts and then view that information. They're going to have to go look up that information within the PDF. And previously external users, they would click on those IDs and then see all that information in Smarts. However, we are currently working to update this tab and we will release it to its full functionality later on in the future. But just a heads up, since these all kind of apply. Okay. We now have the NOT tab. We added a new question for the all construction activities are completed and the final stabilization requirements are met termination option. And that question is, has the final post-construction plan been submitted? Yes or no? If no, then the discharger would need to upload that approved final post-construction plan within the NOT attachments tab. And then moving forward, we also updated a question tied to the site does not discharge stormwater to waters of the US termination option. And we ask, is the site's physical location not hydrologically connected to the waters of the US? If the discharger selects yes, then they must submit a no discharge technical report within the NOT attachments tab. And then upon approval of the NOT, a NONA NOI or a NONA ID, would instantly be issued for this site. It's similar to how for the industrial general permit, how people switch between the NOI or NEC. It's going to be something similar along the lines of that, but we're still working out how that's all going to work. The required NOT documents have been updated to include a final site map, a QSP final NOT inspection, photos depicting final stabilization, and then a long-term maintenance plan. And then as Brandon mentioned, Smarts included a provision that automatically approves a NOT after 30 days of being left in the submitted status if the regional boards have not taken any action on that NOT, such as accept, return, deny, or accept for further review. Moreover, SMARTS will now also send out 1 week prior to 30 days of the NOT being submitted, just so that doesn't go over your guys' heads and you guys miss the 30-day period. So you guys will be notified. Okay, so we have the COI tabs. So there are two different types of COIs, changes of information, excuse me. There is the organization COI and the site COI. And so for the organization COI, everything remains the same and there were no changes. And all fields and functionality are the same as well. It's just on the new screen interface. However, the site COI has since been updated in the following ways. So we program a change of information to allow the removal of residential lots from permit coverage and to turn the NOI into inactive status. We also updated the COI by programming current versus revised columns. The current column contains all of the information initially entered for the application. And then the revised column is going to be left blank to allow users to enter their updated information. And by including both the current and revised columns, it will allow dischargers to view the current data and update only the necessary fields. And so staff updated the COI by incorporating entire NOI tabs and their fields within the COI. And these tabs are generally going to consist of the segments tab, which only apply to linear NOIs, the site information tab, and then the risk information tab. So it'll basically be the whole tab itself in the COI with the current and revised columns. And then we have the notes tab, which we added a new feature to allow internal state board and regional board staff the ability to directly upload communication documents on this tab. So internal staff will no longer need to upload those communication documents to the attachments tab and can do so directly from this tab. And this tab will be read only for dischargers and other external users. So as you can see, there's that attachment option right there for the notes. And this is kind of what the table is going to look like with some general information. And so thank you. That is the end of my presentation. I appreciate you guys' time today. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to either Brandon or myself with using the contact information listed on the slide here. So thank you. Thank you again.
All right, thank you for the in-depth presentation, Matt. We're going to go ahead and continue on to our break. And so I'll go ahead and pull that slide up. There we go. So why don't we go ahead and resume the meeting at 10:31. All right, we'll give it a couple minutes. We're getting some power to the laptops up at the front of the stand here. All righty. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started with our Q&A session. And the way this is going to kind of work, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to prioritize the questions from the folks in the room first, since they made, that long traffic-ridden journey to come into the office today. And then, so I'll probably do like maybe 5 questions from those in the room, and then a question from the chat if we still got any. And then if there's time available, we can go ahead and review additional questions in the chat. So the way it works for the folks in the room, please raise your hand and we'll bring the mics over. Do not ask your question until you have a mic in hand. That way everyone can hear you and the recording captures that as well. And then for those on the online, please let us know if you would like us to unmute you. If you have a question that you want to ask verbally. Otherwise, you can just type your question in the chat and we'll answer those as well. All righty. And then one more thing, just let us know if the question's, directed towards State Water Board or to Regional Water Board staff, and that will help us answer better. And we might, ask each other too. So,
Brandon, this is Marv Saxey. I have a question regarding sampling on the permit. It says you only can take 1 sample, but if there is an exceedance, let's say you're at 450 NTU and you throw down a BMP or 2 or 3 or 4 to make it in compliance, you want to take a sample to see what you've achieved. So now I have 2 samples, but I only can report 1 sample. Which of the 2 or 3 samples can I report? Can I report the one that has achieved the end result of improving my BMPs?
that is a great question. So actually, so the requirement says that you have to take 1 sample per discharge location, right? You can take multiple, but you would have to report all of them if you do take them. So that's a standard kind of MPDS permit requirement, I believe, and I can try and find that in our requirements. But from the 2009 permit, every sample that is collected has to be reported through SMARTS. So in that case, say you have your first sample is going to be exceedance, you still have to put that there, and then it will be a numeric action level exceedance. But then adding the second and third samples that demonstrate that you got it back down would be helpful for the regional water board staff to say like, oh, okay, they're actually implementing corrective actions and seeing some progress there. Will
SMARTS accommodate multiple samples?
I believe so, yes. And Matt, if you're online still,
Yes.
The question was, will be able to accommodate multiple samples?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then I have one other question on establishing risk. Is it mandatory to use the GIS tables? Or if I'm looking at LS and a merchant builder comes into a site, which has all been graded and it's flat, can they use the LS factor for that which is established when they actually acquire the property?
No, so, yes, you can use an individual LS factor that you've calculated. The GIS options are basically tools to make it easier for folks, but if there's site-specific factors that have to be taken into account, that can be done through an individual site-specific method, and the regional water boards would want to confirm that as well. Thank you, Marvin.
Hi there. My name is Joe. I have a question about the dewatering. That's to me, I've been doing this a long time, major change in the permit to have to notify you 24 hours in advance. And when you have open trenches and you got a 3-inch storm coming, you're going to dewater. Can we call you before? Can we email before, knowing that's going to happen, basically, that we're going to take water on?
That's a good question. Leslie, are you reaching for the mic? Okay.
So for us, like what we usually want is we want a sample, you give us your results, let us know that you're within the pH and turbidity that's allowed to discharge if it's all rainwater. So you do still need to make sure that we know that you are within those levels and that we give you permission to discharge prior to doing it, just like we have in the past.
Okay, so that brings up another question. So if you want to sample first, I've already discharged that water. And if I have to notify you 24 hours in advance, how do I do that?
So the 24 hours in advance, like that's not as important as you making sure we know that your sample results. So if you're standing by it and you collect a sample and you call us, these are my results. Can I discharge? Just like before, we'll let you know if you're within the results. Go ahead.
And Leslie, for clarification, are dischargers in this region going to be subject to the requirements in attachment J, or is there a separate MPS permit?
It's the same as like before. Again, we have a separate dewatering permit. So if it is commingling with groundwater, like we have a separate permit already that hasn't changed.
I'm not talking about groundwater. I'm just talking about surface runoff.
Okay.
When
Yeah, correct.
Because when I understood and what you said, what you showed in the slide was about open trenches, taking water and everything,
Mhm.
sediment basins, sediment ponds. Let's say my basins overflow. I have a health and safety issue.
You're going to want to dewater.
So
it.
the-
I'm going to dewater
Yeah.
first.
There
health
have
and
been
safety.
instances in the past where that's happened, but this is where we say, okay, when that happens, okay, it's an emergency. Like, for example, we had a substation where it's flooding, and if the substation gets hit, it's gonna be a problem. So they'll dewater it, but you still have to collect a sample so that we know what it was when you dewatered.
Okay.
So you would report that to us. We had an emergency situation. We couldn't wait for you, but these were our results. This is how much water we discharged with those results. And this is what we plan to do to make sure we don't have this problem in the future.
Okay, so I just want to be, okay, is we all know that contractors are going to dewater, right? Reality out there, it's all about money. They just got to go forward. So we have all this water in the trenches, and you got a QSD that's got to go out there and say, okay, guys, you can't pump. That doesn't create good relationships out there. People ever want to hire you again, and they're just gonna, like that. So are you saying, you also said I could just call you and let you know
As long as we know the results. So that's the main thing, is somebody on site has to be trained to sample and collect that data. So let's say that you, as the QSP can't get out there. If you've trained your contractor and they can take that value, then they can take that value. And still they just have to call us and make sure that we authorize the discharge.
And then if they take the values and we don't have an exceedance,
Then you're okay. But
Then
if you
we
have
can
an
just go-
exceedance, that's where the problem comes into play, because let's say you still have to discharge, but you're not within the parameters that you're allowed, then we need to know that, and we need to know how much water you've discharged under the parameters that weren't acceptable.
okay, but then that goes back to Marvin's question about, about NALs and about discharging.
Oh, for his, like, if you correct it and you take
Right.
multiple, that's fine too. Like, again, it's all about documentation. It's so that we know, like, that one, you're trying, but also that we have documentation of how much you exceeded. So again, the ideal situation, you're going to be within the allowable levels, and then it's not a problem. But again, if you are exceeding, then for your own, protection too, you want to document when you corrected that.
Thank you.
Two quick questions. One was for the sampling. If you have multiple locations that have activities going on and you're sampling from each of those locations, are they weighted by area? Because if you have smaller areas that might have a exceedance in a small area, but you have your 90% of your project is not, is that accounted for in the new?
Yeah, so there is no longer an averaging or weighting of the samples. The compliance is going to be on a discharge location basis. So in the sense, like if you had that small portion that was in exceedance, the corrective actions would have to be made for that specific area, not for the entire, the compliant part of the site.
Okay.
Mhm.
And then the second one was I heard that there was a Russell 2 software. Is there one that you guys endorse or have out there, or is it we just we look for it ourselves?
I know the widely available one is the one from the USDA, and there's one from Caltrans as well. And I think I would go with the Caltrans one over the USDA one. But hopefully as we rely on Russell 2 more in this permit and maybe in future permits, the state water board can produce one of their own, but that's a skill set that's not necessarily that we don't necessarily have in house. And so that might take a while to actually produce, but I know some of the consultants out there have some pretty nifty versions of Russell too. So.
Good morning. My name is Latoya Waters, and I have 2 questions as well. If the project is phased out over a period of time, let's say years, is that still considered part of a larger plan development?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
And part of that, it's not in this permit, but maybe in future issuances of the permit, we might consider adding like a time length. But that's for a different permit. So
Thank you.
it makes sense. So
Thank you.
and then we'll take one more question
Second
from the
question,
room.
second
Oh,
question,
sorry.
Second question in regards to dewatering. If, the construction site does contact regional board and they're not in any exceedances or what have you, they're within their realm, can they discharge to the MS4? Will the regional board or state board allow the construction site to discharge to the MS4?
So first of all, like, again, you need to contact the city and get permission before. So
Thank
we're not
you.
the ones that are authorizing that. They will. But for as far as like our permit, what we're concerned about is that it is within those levels.
Okay, good. So from a city standpoint, we can kind of enforce that.
No, you need to contact the city.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. And then we'll take Matt, one question from Matt, and then we'll move on to some from the chat.
All right, this one is for the regional board staff. Will they be taking an early proactive role in reviewing and holding QSDs that are not preparing compliant plans with TMDLs accountable, in the permit? It's important because QSDs that are preparing and charging for an actual full plan and evaluating all of the risks and everything and putting in those are going to be at competitive disadvantages of the firms that are not doing that. And is that on your radar to address early on in the implementation?
So what I can say is that we'll definitely be reviewing those in the SWIPs as we do for our constructions when we're on sites. I don't think there's any way to review all of them when they come in for the new SWIPs because they go to state board. So I know as an inspector, when we're on site, that's something we're definitely going to be reviewing and making sure that they are implementing them to start.
And I'm just going to add, again, like part of the reason that we have this new part in the permit where we are tracking performance based on QSDs and QSPs is that we have noticed, that there is a difference between different QSDs and how they prepare documents and even how they inspect sites. So we will be tracking that. And as we observe deficiencies, it will be kind of like oh, look, here they are again. Because it's not like we forget who you guys are. We do see the same ones again, and we do know who's doing a good job and who's not. And so this is giving us that opportunity to really enforce that.
What is that sort of enforcement level of it? Because if the owners aren't actually being aware of it, it doesn't change anything.
Yeah. So as Brandon mentioned earlier, like it's going to be an iterative process. So at first, like we can, mandate more training. But then also in addition to that, like how the owners are going to be informed is when we are actually inspecting those plans, what are we going to do is we're going to tell the owner this is deficient. It's not up to par. And so at that point, they either need to make sure that their QSD gets it up to par or, get a different one that will, or they're going to face enforcement.
And then I wanted to add just from a little bit of a process standpoint, the state water board is the one who does approve the applications for coverage under the CGP. And during that process, we take a quick glance at the stormwater pollution prevention plan to see if major things are there. We don't do an in-depth review necessarily. And so we leave that in the hands of the regional water boards when they're actually going out to the site and checking the stormwater pollution prevention plans for that part of the enforcement. And so there is potential for us to maybe do a little bit more of an in-depth review, especially if we have some of those key names that were on our naughty list, so okay. And
also, I was just going to add in, like, if you guys, because you guys are as QSCs and other professionals, you're also aware of what's going on at the sites. And let's say even like you get let go from a site and they hired somebody because they're going to be cutting corners. You can let us know. Like there is a, email, hey, guess what, water board, look what they're doing. And we do look into that as well.
And we are promoting using the office or the Cal EPA's environmental complaint system, I think is what it's called, as a means for our Office of Enforcement at State Water Board to funnel a lot of those complaints and then deliver those to the regional water boards as well. So that's always an option to consider. Okay, does anyone want to read any questions from the chat that we could answer for those in the room?
One question from Kat. Will the TMDL mapping tool include all water bodies in a TMDL? So if this has been already responded, if you would like to add.
I can go ahead and answer that. So to my knowledge, the way the TMDL mapping tool is structured is it's going to provide you the watersheds. I don't think it provides necessarily specific water bodies within that watershed unless the TMDL was meant to address a specific water body, if that makes sense.
There have been several questions about the presentation and the transcripts of this meeting. So as mentioned in the chat, it will be posted to the State Board website later, maybe sometime later this summer. It needs to go through a review process to be ADA compliant. So just to answer a blanket response to that question. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to get it out before the effective date of the permit. And so I'm shooting for early August because I have a few more of these presentations in the next few weeks that are occupying a lot of time. So. Okay, and then maybe one more question from the chat for now, and then we'll move back to people in the room.
There was a question about waters of the U.S. I believe this was from Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Was there more to the question, or just is it answered already? Okay.
Yeah, so I was just gonna kind of clarify, because here we have from Peter. He says that within attachment J, it does say that you don't need to have approval, just 24-hour notice that you're going to dewater. So if it's within the allowable values, then okay. If you're going to be discharging something outside of those values, then you better be reporting and letting us know how much you reported, outside of those values.
Sorry. So here's the question from Chris. Can you define waters of the U.S. so we know when the buffer applies? He tried to look up, but there's a little bit of confusion there. So I don't know if we can respond to that question.
Yeah, I mean,
Chris, whether that's related to SACIT.
Yeah, so for those who may be aware of Supreme Court decisions that have been coming out, there was a SACIT decision recently that redefines what the waters of the United States are. And so that's making it a little challenging to directly answer what waters of the U.S. are. And so typically it would be a navigable water of the United States, or like a permanent stream, in my opinion, or permanent wet, or actually the wetlands one's the one I want to stay away from. So I think that's related to the SACIT decision. So Chris, you can follow up that question with me online or via email, and I will get you an answer from my attorneys at the State Water Board who are following that closely.
Next question. Where and when will all trainings for the 2022 CGP Roadshow be posted?
Okay, I think we kind of answered that a little bit earlier, but I'm shooting to post the recordings of these workshops and then a PDF copy of the presentation in August, early August, hopefully. Okay, and then let's go ahead and take some more questions from those in the room.
Hi, hello. Yeah, I just have a question. I want to know whether CGP applies to projects that are not part of a common plan of development, but they have multiple locations that are separated by at least a quarter of a mile, and each location has less than 1 acre of DSA.
Okay, so let me try and reiterate that. So your question is, if the projects aren't part of a larger common plan,
Correct.
are separated by at least a quarter of a mile, and are less than an acre, do they require perfect coverage? The answer of that would be no.
Okay. So basically each location has less than 1 acre. So we don't have to add it up and say, well, since the total is more than an acre, then.
Right, because they're separated by that
Okay.
distance of a quarter of a mile. Yeah.
But if one location has more than 1 acre, then CGP applies.
Yeah, it would
and
apply
then
for
we
that
need to-
specific location.
Very
Mhm.
good. Thank you.
Yep.
Dealing with the planned disturbed acreage versus disturbed area remaining on smarts and handling, if you have like 160 acre project, and so you would fill out 160 acres is going to be over the entire project life, the amount of land disturbed, but you're going to do like 10, 12 acres at a time of grading, building, and keep moving. Are you going to have to COI the completion? Like if you finish 4 acres and you're going to start 4 acres, do you COI off 4 acres and then COI in 4 acres? Or is it like, how do you balance? Because you're going to want to take those 4 out of compliance terminate, like for NO, you're going to take them out. It's stabilized. You're going to photo document that, but then you're going to start on another area within that developed area. So how does that functionally work with those definitions in the system?
So I don't think it changes much. So if you know you're disturbing all those acres, I would just include it, and then you can just remove the ones, even if they're not active. Just say, hey, these are the acres we're disturbing, and then keep removing with the COI once it's completed to remove it from the total disturbed area.
But we're getting charged by the acre, so for the annual fee. So you don't want to pay for 160 acres when you're working on 15 to 20 at a time over 6, 7, 8 years.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. That's something we'll probably have to discuss and talk about and see going forward.
Matt, do you have any more to elaborate on that?
So I did send this Michael Colbin flag. He wanted to know the difference. And the total plan to disturb acreage is the acreage that the project plans to disturb for the entire project. And this is going to be a static field that can only increase acreage via COI. Whereas the disturbed acreage is how much acreage is actually being disturbed at the time. And that field can be updated and can increase or decrease via a COI. It does get tricky though, because we do want you to incorporate all aspects of the project in that disturbed acreage field, but we can probably discuss a little bit more and see how we want to go about doing that, if we need to make any updates.
All right, so the answer is forthcoming.
And then just real quick, when it comes to ad hoc reports, annual reports, and NOTs, is smarts getting updated so that LRPs can do all at once and not do an annual report and then have to, at a later date, after the QS, it goes back in and gets the NOT ready for LRP certification because they can't figure out how to do that, to log back in again at another date? Or can we get all available things to be certified at once?
That's a question for Matt again.
So you're asking, can you mass certify things? Is that correct?
Matt,
Well, it right now it's a required sequence of you can't certify an NOT until an A report is certified.
Yes, and that still will remain the same moving forward.
Okay, I think we have a gentleman in the back over here who's been waiting, or before Marvin, I think. Yeah. Sorry, Marvin.
Thank you. My question is about inspections. So the changes to pre and post, like windows, is that going to be active on September 1st for jobs covered under the existing one? Or are you still going to be in the 48-hour window for a job that's already started? And then similarly, the delegates can't do pre-storm. Is that the same thing, effective for jobs covered under the existing permit? Or is that just starting in 2025 or for new jobs?
It's only going to be for jobs that have the 2022 permit coverage. So the requirements of the 2009 permit will still apply to those in the regulatory transition period. And so that's why, for some folks, they might like the monitoring requirements of the 2022 permit more, and they are welcome to switch over to that by applying for coverage under the 2022 permit. And then when they on their 2009 permit, WDID, they would just say, notice of termination, we have coverage under the new permit.
Okay. And then one other thing, I didn't see anything about REAPs. Those.
So REAPs are actually gone. They're no longer part of the 2022 permit, but they will be for any of the 2009 projects that are continuing on. Good questions.
This is Mark again. If a TMDL parameter is listed in your source inventory, but it's not exposed to stormwater in terms of the fact it's undercover or it's rainproof shelter, is it necessary to sample the water for that TMDL parameter?
I want to say that the language talks about the potential for discharge. So if there's no potential for discharge, they wouldn't be considered a responsible discharger for that TMDL. But say something happens to that cover or something happens to that container where that material is now able to be exposed to stormwater and discharge, then they would become a responsible discharger and have to comply, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And then the other question is when it comes to zinc, because galvanization is used in many construction materials which are exposed after construction to stormwater, how do you reconcile the fact that there could be a zinc TMDL exceedance when it's allowed to be exposed to stormwater?
That's a great question. And I'm wondering if the regional folks have encountered that for, like industrial sites and what to do there.
Under the pollutant source assessment for, part of the SWIP, you are required to identify your sources. And if there is a potential for a background of zinc in your site, it could be naturally occurring with the soil, then you just need to document that there is such a thing. And then you can let us know about background sources. And in relation to your earlier question about other pollutants that may not be exposed, if it's present at your site as a part of a construction material, then it's an inventory that you are supposed to include in your pollutant source assessment.
Yes, it'll be in the assessment, but you don't have to sample for it in the discharge water.
Unless unless you trigger the non-visible pollutant monitoring, yes. But yeah, the zinc is a tricky question, and we get that a lot for both permits. And it's hard, especially when you have the galvanized, roofs or fences, which are intended for outdoor use, right? And I think, in the spirit of the total maximum daily load, they would encourage not using those materials, I think. So
just real quick, is the file size attachment going to remain the same in smarts?
Matt, that's going to be a question for you. Is the file size going to remain the same for the attachments in smarts? And I believe is it 25? 75 megabytes right now.
We can look into expanding that. I know we haven't talked too much with the programmers about it yet, but I know we wanted to incorporate some new document, what kind of documents we can accept. But so I'll make a note of that, and we'll look into potentially increasing that if possible.
Are you, or just a follow-up question, are you coming from a place where you would like more, a larger file size? Okay, so noted.
Hi there. I had a question about when you talked about with the ATS about bypass.
Mhm.
Can you go into that a little more?
Yeah, so let me go ahead and go back to that screen if I can. Sharing. Oh, I'm not sharing. Maybe the screen's not even that helpful, but essentially the new permit allows for bypass, which it previously didn't. And what we were seeing there is if you're, because ATS systems are fairly expensive to operate, we provided the bypass option for dischargers who have stormwater that's already compliant with the numeric action levels of the permit. So the 250 NTU and then the pH range from 6.5 to 8.5. If your stormwater is compliant, you don't have to run it through your ATS and operate it at, a cost. That said, you might have certain discharge points that are compliant, others that are not. You might want to use your active treatment selectively to address it. But yeah. Yeah. Right, right.
But you're saying if you have this one area that goes through that's clean water going one way, it needs to turn.
Yeah.
You don't have to mingle that
Right.
with water that's
Right.
that has.
You should be using your active treatment selectively to address the problem areas of the site. Yeah. Oh, we'll take one.
Question. You can identify more than one QSD in smarts from what they just showed. If you have an NAL exceedance and you have a QSP, primarily is a QSP level, but they also have a QSD. Is it the QSD, the primary QSD that has to do the QSD inspection? Or is it a QSD certified person that would do the NAL exceedance inspection? That's maybe to the same QSP, but they're not the ones that are really acting as the QSD of the project.
Right. Technically, a QSD can do the inspection or is required to do the inspection. So it could be someone who is a QSD and QSP for the site. The intent of that requirement, though, for the numeric action level exceedance inspections is that the active QSD and the active QSP for the site are communicating and understanding what is leading to these exceedances. And so the intent is for, two individuals, if they're not the same individual for the particular site, are going out there ideally together. I know scheduling can be an issue, so that's not required. That way they can go through the site, walk through it, and identify the problem areas. But because QSDs are QSPs, technically one person can do the inspections.
But so it's not stating that, like in smarts where you check the primary QSD.
The primary doesn't have any effect on
So
who
it's just
does
a
the
QSD is the requirement.
Yeah. Marking primary is just something for us to know who's like kind of, yeah. No, never.
Okay, so we're switching to the chat questions. A question from Peter Schellenbarger. I'm not sure if I'm saying the name correctly. I'm sorry. Attachment J notes that dewatering requires 24-hour notice. He would just like to ask a verbal response to the question if water board approval for dewatering is required from the discharger. So if I can respond to that first, I just want to remind in the Los Angeles region that there is a separate NPDES dewatering permit. I think it's only available in Region 4. And if it's dewatering of groundwater, we would require construction general permittees to apply for a dewatering permit. And we actually have our supervisor for the program present here on the floor as we speak. If you guys have any questions to that effect. But at the same time, going back to Peter's question about approval from the water board for dewatering, I would probably caution, because depending on the risk level of the project, level 2 and level 3 are required sampling. But if there's dewatering that needs to be done on a level 1, under the circumstances of, you know, qualifying events, really high rain event, as we just experienced, we would probably ask to sample before dewatering, just to make sure that pH and turbidity and the numeric action levels are met before discharge.
In order to be able to discharge, you have to put your discharge through a BMP. To be able to discharge that, you still have to do something. So how can you sample before you discharge if you're pumping it like through a silt bag or a berm of some kind for filtering? How can you sample before you discharge if you physically have to discharge it to be able to sample it?
There are some instances that it's direct discharge without a BMP. So in the cases where there's a discharge through a filter, then yes. If there's a BMP already in place, we would assume that it already passed the pH and the turbidity benchmarks, but there are sites that will discharge directly. So the mention earlier was in that kind of scenario. So Brandon.
Or I was gonna say, you know, it's a little challenging when there's 2 different permits that might be applying, right? And so what we're gonna try and do is create a frequently asked questions document, and in that identify, you know, which regional permits or even state water board permits might take place instead of attachment J. But for attachment J, it does require the discharge to be analyzed within the first hour of discharge. And it also just requires the 24-hour notice requirement. So you could begin discharging as long as the regional water board is notified. And then you would take your sample within that first hour to compare it to the numeric action levels.
And just to add in, like, just the moral of the story, sample what you're discharging and record it so that you have that documentation. You can show that you weren't doing something wrong. If you are discharging, let's say like you didn't sample and like you notice it's exceeding, well then stop discharging if you can. So that's the moral of the story, is just documentation. Make sure that you're protecting yourself and showing what your values are.
Notifying the water board, you're saying make a phone call, right? What type of documentation is that if we all know that it's document?
Yeah, so good question. So as far as like documentation to us, like when you're trying to notify us, it can be an email or a phone call, but anything should be uploaded to Smarts. So when you take a picture of whatever your results are that you've written down, make sure it's uploaded in Smarts.
That helps, you know. I think it's just for us in protecting our clients is a phone call gets lost. Where's the recording? You're going to go back and track your phone call. It sounds like an email to, if you know who your inspector is, or to the stormwater section to say, hey, we're discharging, or, you know, we had a 4-inch storm and we have to discharge and we have samples.
Correct. That's like always the best case. And again, like the phone call, that's more for your expedience. Like, let's say, oh no, I'm discharging right now. I want to talk to someone. We are available. If you're, you know, within working hours, if it's outside of that, you're out of, you know, you just have to document anyways. But an email, always follow up, and then always upload to Smarts.
Thank
I just wanted to add and reiterate what Leslie and Risa has said before. For the instances where you guys are utilizing BMPs, the example, as you mentioned, dams or filters, on your first, when you're first starting to discharge and filtering your stormwater, make sure that you collect a sample, take a photograph, document that, and then submit that to the water board. If it's within the limits, as Leslie mentioned before, just give us a call, send us an email, and we will approve it. But if it has exceeded, stop right away, because we're gonna go through different stages now. If you're dewatering, water, storm water that is being contaminated with other pollutants. There are instances where you're not gonna filtrate the water if you have impoundments, excavation, large sizes, large basins, if you will, where you have excavated and the water just collected there. If you just want to test it, the pH and the water of that water, and it's within the limits, you're free to discharge. But again, documentation, email and submit it through SMARTS is the best way for us to analyze it. And if this is something that you must done on the same day, give us a call. We are, all these teams, all these people integrating this team that you can call us, and we will give you your answer as soon as you can and as soon as you provide the evidence. But again, the most important part is evidence, photographs, for your protection and for your customers' protection as well.
No.
No, there's a tab that says notes, and you can upload it there, or you can upload it as an attachment, but with the right title. Results from, testing stormwater or water that ain't been stored in impoundment on a structure. These are my results, pH and turbidity. Is that clear? I see you make the question, the face. Yes, but you have to make sure that one is getting the authorization to discharge, and then you add hot report. It's either or, but again, evidence, that's what we need. You can do both, or you can do just the ad hoc report and let us know, and we will review that ad hoc report.
If I can just add to that, and this is essentially important because we now have the TMDL requirements. So I would just like to remind that there will be enforcement for NEL or NAL exceedances. We have NELs for the TMDLs. So I just want to remind that we have we need some documentations of those discharges that are exceeding NELs. And another reminder that we are required to analyze for non-visible pollutants using a certified laboratory under the ELAB laboratory accreditation program. This was not a requirement in the current permit, but it is a requirement to have that kind of quality data when you analyze for non-visible pollutant towards the numeric effluent limitations. So if you have any questions to that effect, let us know. We can refer you to the ELAP website and any other laboratories that are around our region that are certified, and any other questions regarding TMDLs. So if I have one last question, I believe in chat. This is from Jeremy. Do local city county post-construction requirements override the CGP post-construction requirements, even if they are less stringent?
Yes. So the way the permit is structured is dischargers are supposed to comply with the MS4 post-construction requirements. And if there is a construction project outside of those jurisdictions, they would comply with the 2022 permits post-construction requirements.
I'm sorry, I missed one. So there's another chat question. Is there going to be a document that summarizes the differences between the 2009 and 2022 permit. And this is from Mr. Horowitz.
I think a comprehensive document that outlines all the differences is probably not going to be available. But through the training that the CGP TT is releasing, and then future guidance that we'll be releasing, we'll try and point out the main differences between the two permits. Also, I did see some other questions in the chat kind of regarding the stormwater professional training. One of them was related to self-registered QSDs and QSPs. Do they have to do continuing education? And the answer is no for that. It'd be nice if they did some, but it's not required. And then let's see. There was another question regarding whether say a self-certified QSD has their PE. If they have an engineer in training that is assisting them, can they be a delegate? And the answer is yes, they can be a delegate. They just have to be trained per the permit requirements. So do their foundational training and do their site-specific training. Do you need a COI if you're changing the primary QSD on smarts? The answer is no. Or I do not believe so is what I actually answered. And I don't think that's true. Matt, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. No COIs needed to update the QSD.
Okay, are there any other questions in the room?
There is another chat question.
Okay.
Just asking for clarification of local requirement, whether it's the city is stringent or I'm not sure. We only need to follow that. So local requirement in terms of, I believe this is a question about post-construction. Again, for post-construction local requirement, if the site is under phase 1 or phase 2, the post-construction will follow the requirements of the city or county. Otherwise, I believe there's the water balance calculator that it needs to be filled out as well.
Yeah, so even if the local requirement is, quote, less stringent, you are still required to follow the post-construction requirements of the MS4. Not necessarily the more stringent one, if like say the 2022 permits requirements are more stringent than that. And then Sarah followed that up with the city/county is the one who's going to be approving the post-construction documentation. And then our regional water board staff, when they're doing their inspections and the reviews of those documents are the ones who will be ensuring that they're implemented in the field.
Any other questions from the floor? I don't think I see any more in chat.
Matt's got a hand up.
I'm always here to serve. Going back to smarts, in the beginning of the NOI form, I think it said, does a project have phases? What's the definition of a phase for the NOI? I mean, for the permit, we've got phases of construction, but it might be very helpful to have that defined and clarified of what NOI phase is talking about versus a project phase. Because I mean, are you talking about like, we're going to build these 12 acres first, that's phase 1. Phase 2 is 3 years from now. Once this is completed and operating, then we go there. Like that's totally different than the phasing defined in the permit.
Right.
So I think that would be a helpful item on there.
Okay.
Because otherwise everybody should say yes.
Right. I mean, yeah, because every construction site should have phases.
Beginning
right?
and an end. Those are 2 phases. So,
right. Matt, do you have any more to add for that question or statement?
I just would like a little bit more clarification as to what his question really is.
Okay, so my understanding is that looking at the NOI, that one of the pictures that you shared, there was a question that asked whether or not the project is phased, and you want what phased is defined as in that question specifically, because in the permit we have like the grading phase, the vertical
Mhm.
development phase. Is that what that question means? Or is that question meaning, does this project have basically multiple start and end dates for different sections of like a plot of land?
The reason we added that is because what we've seen is a lot of dischargers try to submit like applications for one phase of construction, and then they would continually submit COIs to increase acreage to incorporate additional phases, and they would just keep doing that. And we want the discharger to incorporate all phases of construction up front in their PRDs when they are submitting their NOI, rather than, submitting their PRDs for one phase and then continually submitting increases of acreage to a COI. So that was the purpose of that question. We don't stop them, but we do provide them with a pop-up if they do say that they phase their construction out. So they're, aware that what we're looking for is the entire project being captured, not just one part, and then, you continually just add on to kind of game the system. So.
But you're already doing that in the total acreage question versus the disturbed acreage area. So that's where I think there's sort of the confusion of, because you're asking for it already in a second place of total acreage for the project, but the annual fee is calculated off of the disturbed area. Going back to my earlier question of how do you handle phasing of working in, if you're doing 10 acres at a time out of a 160 acre project, so it's kind of on top of each other there and can cause confusion.
And I think we said we'd follow up with that question later. So we'll tie them together.
Yeah. And I mean, right now, how we have it is it's based on the disturbed acreage. And for the most part, the total planned and the disturbed in the initial PRD should be the same. That's not always the case, but for the most part, they should be the same. And then you would decrease acreage as you've completed sections, complying with the NOT requirements as well. And then you could decrease the total disturbed, or the disturbed acreage remaining field. So what the purpose of the total plan is, so we could see what the project started with for the entire project, and then the disturbed is to see what's being disturbed. But we will follow up with that and then see if we can provide any more information for your question.
And then Leslie had some.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that it was my understanding too that the reason that was put in was because we have some people who do different like permits, like a whole nother WDID for, we're going to do demolition. We're going to do grading. we're going to build now. But it's still the same LRP, still the same owner. So instead of having 3 different permits, is it going to be, phased? Is there going to be, different processes? Like instead of getting a whole nother permit, just incorporate it in one permit.
Looks like we have another question from the floor.
I guess just to kind of continue this one, would the phasing be just similar to the LUP where you do it in segments? Where basically, like you said, if you have a 160 acre project and then you break it up into the 10 acres that they do it at a time, is that what the phasing is set up there for?
I don't think it's going to look like the LUP segments in Smarts itself. I think you're just, and Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, you're just changing a number in Smarts indicating how much is being actively disturbed.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Okay.
Because I know you get like a start date and an end date for each segment.
Yeah.
For doing it that.
I don't think it for traditional construction projects is going to look like that.
Okay.
Nurse, do you have more questions in the chat?
I'm just revisiting a question from Robert Reiner. It's about whether the regional board or the state board is going to reach out to local agencies like the cities and the counties that are, approving or doing plan checks of designs and building permits. So in this case, we received previously, historically, we've always received calls from permittees and asking us to review their SWIP because the cities are, or the counties are not giving their permit out because they're waiting for the WDID. So I believe this might be a maths question, whether once they submitted the NOI and submitted the PRDs, I believe WDIDs are issued after with the pay and E authorization. So that is what the city, the WDID number is what the city is waiting for to approve their plan checks, I believe. That process, but just want to mention that for new permittees, we do not review and approve SWIPs during the application process. I also would like to add a few items, relating to notice of terminations and chains of information. Unfortunately, our region has a high volume of requests for NOTs, and I'm sure a lot of the permittees are wondering, where's our NOT? What's going on? It's been 30 days. It's been 60 days. So I must say that we do process NOTs in the order received. We do process, our unit process notice of terminations for industrial and construction. And there's just so much we review documentation. So for any NOTs or COIs included that don't provide supporting documentation, it will definitely delay our review process. So I just want to remind everyone that any documentation you can provide with your NOT or your COI will help us expedite our review process. When we have sufficient documentation for example, for notice of termination, really good photo log that are submitted with the notice of termination, it helps us because we can tell that the site is really fully stabilized. So we look for stabilization, we look for temporary BMPs present and any other issues at the site. So if we don't have any of those documentation, it forces us to come out to your site and inspect. So again, we do other inspections, not just NOTs. So we will, I must say that process right now will take up to 90 days, just to let you know.
I just want to add for the NOT process, when you guys are requesting notice of termination for changing ownership, please make sure that we have the information of the new owner. Sometimes it's very difficult to approve a site, to terminate a site without the information. And it takes us a long time. Usually those are the cases that, in my experience, it takes a little bit longer than others because we need to investigate who's the new owner if the construction site is not complete. And again, it will be in the benefit for you, for your company to submit that information as well. Because again, it takes a while to find a new owner sometimes. Thank you.
Okay, I've been combing through the chat a little bit, and there were some questions related to passive treatment systems that I wanted to address from Seneca Dykes. So the first question I saw was, how would low or high pH be treated for passive treatment systems? And that's essentially the same way you would treat any of your discharges, through applying products that lower pH or increase pH as needed. And then I think there was a question towards the end, also from Seneca. How are discharges from passive treatment systems addressed when discharge is outside the allowable range for pH? And Andrew answered in the chat, all permittees are required to meet established pH and turbidity ranges prior to discharge. If a passive treatment cannot meet these standards, it is the discharger's responsibility to implement additional best management practices to ensure that standards are met. And by standards, we mean the numeric action levels. I see a question. Could you provide an example completed screens to address the discrepancies in smarts? I'm not sure exactly what that means, but then there's another question, and this can be answered by the regional water boards. What triggers an inspection by the water boards? It says state water board, but usually it's the regional water board staff that are conducting the inspections.
For construction sites, the regional board is required to do compliance inspections. So that is one example of a trigger for an inspection. Another would be the notice of termination or a change of information to confirm information at the site. Another trigger would be if there's public complaint. There's illicit discharges, like as I mentioned earlier, there was a site that was discharging directly into the storm drain, and the water looks really turbid and green, and it was risk level 1. So that triggers potentially a public that is probably CGP savvy can catch that, and it will report to the EPA complaint system, and that triggers for us to come out.
Yeah, so I'd like to add too, we typically look at the annual reports too that trigger a lot of the stuff. So if we look at the inspections in our smarts system, and also when we're out and about doing our normal inspections that we have a list for, if we see a site that poor BMPs, we'll definitely stop by and see what's going on and make sure they are in compliance.
On that, you guys have a 20% annual permit inspection requirement by the EPA, right? Of active permits?
I believe we have 10, but there's a different filter, whether it's 5 acre or more as well.
Okay. Back on the NOT, the system asks for why you're NOTing it, like what your reason is for it, but you only can choose one. Not every, I've have a site where I'm terminating it under coverage of another permit. I have another part that's stabilized, and I have another one that was sold to another owner. So just if there's a way to make smarts available to be a little bit more flexible, I mean, it would make it easier, but you know, not everything is a one answer fits all situation. But in my documentation, I spell it all out with photo log and everything, but I don't know how, if it triggers on your end, anything, but because it's literally 3 different causes of what the land is being terminated under. So I have one project that the client sold. It's 18 acres. They sold 3 acres. So now it's owned by somebody else and being developed. They've graded, but revegetated, stabilized 12 acres. And the remaining acreage is being covered under a WDR for an on-site septic systems permit. So all of that acreage is now not under the need of the CGP coverage, because there's one's being covered by another permit of discharge and quality compliance. It's stabilized and it's owned by another owner.
I'm gonna defer this question to Matt. I believe there's another option called other that you can.
But all 3 of those are the ones that are your choices.
So I guess, Matt, your
just saying flexibility.
Your suggestion is to have, instead of, you know, a bubble button where you just click, you can only pick one, to have one where you can check multiple.
Yeah.
Matt, can we make note of that?
Yeah, we can make note of that. But you know, as Nursa said, the best way as of now is to just select other, list the 3 separate things, provide, you know, the photo documentation, documentation of the new owner, and maybe the WDR number or the other permit number. And I think that would be sufficient enough. And the regional boards, they can, you know, it's at their discretion what they are looking for. But I think that would be sufficient. But I'll make a note of that.
Okay, thank you.
And then just to I'm sorry, just to add, within the NOT application tab, you might have those choices that you just mentioned, but we also have the descriptive box on the bottom where you can cite the reason of your termination if we don't have the choice on top. And that usually help us a lot when you provide more than what is listed in SMARTS. Thank you.
I was just going to add too, as far as like us, we're the ones evaluating it. So when you submit it, we're not going to be like, oh, how dare you? you clicked other, unless it's completely wrong. You know, so if you are clearly identifying that all the parts are covered and we can see, oh, look, this is not covered because of this is not covered for this, and we don't have any like problem with that. But if you say something that's inaccurate, that's where we have an issue, where you say, oh, it's completed, but we go out there and it's not completed. So it needs to match what you're saying, and we need to understand what you're saying so that we can see clearly that it's all stabilized or not owned anymore.
We have a few more questions in chat. Question, well, I don't know if this is a comment from Martin for NOTs. Would you allow a drone video of the stabilized site since you will need to see the site and backyards? So I asked my staff on how they would treat this. If the drone has the documentation of time and date, I would assume that might be okay.
Yeah, I think I can respond to that. I would say yes. If you have all the department information showing everything stabilized, the timestamp date to prove that stabilized, we would accept that.
Yeah. And we've heard questions from other dischargers where they're like, can we use CCTV as a means of, you know, doing their inspections as well? And the answer is potentially. I mean, we'd want to evaluate whether the CCTV is actually capturing all of the activities that's going on the site, all the BMPs that are being implemented on the site. And so if it does provide a very representative, I guess, window into the site, then that would be acceptable. We're trying to, you know, leave our antiquated past behind and move on to using technology to improve our compliance strategies. Another question, Matt?
Yeah, I kind of want to get perspective from the regional board, and state, I guess. Who on a job site would, if for safety considerations of being able to inspect during a rain event or sample, where do you accept the liability for that decision as reasonable? I have a project where the contractor shuts the site down in the beginning of the rain because it's haul roads, dirt haul roads along a mountainous route. And it's whereas the third party oversight for the federal government's ownership party says that's an unreasonable, no, you should be out there sampling. And we're stuck in the middle of my client, the contractor says we're not allowed on site, and third party oversight MMRP group is saying, no. But how do you guys interpret that kind of situation?
There is definitely a factor to safety. So we would probably apply a similar rationale as the industrial general permit when you cannot sample for safety reasons. You mentioned MMRP, and you know, during rain events, it's double hazard for me. I think you're referring to munitions, right?
No, mitigation measure report.
Oh,
part.
got it.
They're
Okay,
overseeing
so-
the environmental compliance for the own, like the requirements of, so that they're a third party oversight group hired to make a contractor's life miserable.
So in this case, we would probably ask to document this in the situation, the site conditions, and submit it to us that were unable to sample. And again, this sampling requirement is new to the permit. So there's going to be a lot of scenarios that will play out later on once we hit September 1st. So, but documentation, as mentioned earlier, will actually be looked at and reviewed.
But as far as the documentation goes, though, like, I mean, if the contractor sends an email out that all personnel are to leave the site, like, is that acceptable documentation? Or because when it comes to the annual reporting, I don't know if it's going to change for this new one, but it's like, how many qualifying events occurred? 6. How many were sampled? 2. Why were 4 of them not? If I'm responding at that time that 3 of them were unsafe conditions to be sampled, like, are you going to question that? Like, just trying to understand how we as the practitioners of this permit can operate compliantly for our client, but also push back against unreasonable requirements.
Okay, yeah, what we can do, what we do actually at the water board, again, everything is evidence documentation. We can adjust for your for the consulting company when to be there or not, as long as they can prove again to the water board that it was unsafe to be on site. We will review that. You can only take you can only monitor your site when it's safe to do that, and that's what the permit requires. And we just go by the permit requirements. But again, because you guys need to do your weekly inspections, this is something that you guys can note on your weekly inspections. You know, and also on your forecast raining event, how much precipitation is coming. I mean, with that, you can, there's many different ways to provide evidence to the water board that it was unsafe the time that the consultant firm is asking you not to be there. But if the consultant firm is just asking you not to be there because they don't want a sample, or, you know, it's another matter. But again, documentation proves that, and that's what we review. And if the documents show that it was safe to be there, and you guys didn't collect the sample or didn't conduct monitoring events at that time, so this is something that we're gonna investigate as well.
All right, yeah, it's hard to prove if something was unsafe by a photo when you can't be there to take the photo.
No, but there are
It's kind of that negative option.
There are ways, you know, you can provide documentation for NOAA, the National Atmospheric Agency documentation that is gonna rain and high amount. You guys are in a hill, so it's not safe because of the amount of rain that is gonna be precipitating that day. You know, examples like that, not just because, you know, you just wanna be absent not to take a sample. And I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just saying, you know, documentation, we will review it. And if you can prove it with documentation from the internet for the accepted agencies that the permit requires, we will review that and we will take it.
If I can just read out another chat question. This is coming from Ricardo. If a discharger has a different NPDES permit that allows dewatering, would either the CGP or the dewatering permit supersedes, or one can decide which permit to use for dewatering? So I might direct this question to our colleague here on the floor. If I don't know if Agustin can respond to this question. So the question is, if a discharger has a different NPDES permit that allows dewatering, would either the CGP or the dewatering permit supersedes, or one can decide which permit to use for dewatering?
Well, the CGP regulates rainwater, stormwater. The dewatering permit regulates mostly groundwater. However, if rainwater mixes with groundwater, let's say in a sump, then you are going to be regulated by the general NPDES permit and not the CGP for that.
So that is correct. If stormwater is commingled with groundwater or other waters that would be regulated under the dewatering permit, the dewatering permit will supersede. If it's just stormwater, then attachment J of the CGP applies, right? And And then I was gonna say something else, but I think that was it.
I have a question regarding sampling under a qualifying precipitation event. Every now and then our NOAA doesn't actually get it too accurate. What happens if we get a phone call and say it's raining and it wasn't forecast? When do we sample? What do? Do we wait for a half inch as we do now? Or it's not in the NOAA forecast?
That's a great question. And I want to say that based on my discussions with the Office of Enforcement, the key is documentation. And I mentioned that in my presentation today as well. So what we're going to be looking for is how you base your monitoring decisions on. It's like what forecast that you based it on. And so if you pull the forecast, and our recommendation is to pull forecast daily, and it showed that it wasn't a qualifying precipitation event. So say you didn't even do a pre-storm inspection, we're not going to hold you accountable for doing that pre-storm inspection because it wasn't required at the time. Say the day of it is raining and your forecast now updates to show that it's a qualifying precipitation event, we would kind of expect you to still do the monitoring if there's discharge, and if do a during storm inspection if it's a qualifying precipitation event. But if the key is documentation. So
Yeah, but if it's discharging just a little bit and it's still not forecasted, what do?
I think you'd be, exempt, but
We will review that, but we also try to encourage rain gauge on sites. So if you have that, that will make our job easier and easier for us. Yes. That will be one way. And the other way, again, if you have just a low amount where you're not able to sample, but you document it. I mean, there are many ways. You can take photographs, you can take logs, document it. You mentioned NOAA didn't provide that forecasted event that they print it out, put it on your notes, give it to us with evidence. We can move on. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thanks.
There's a chat question from Allison.
Sure.
Sorry. This is, I believe, a question of safety. Are railroad right-of-way portions within a construction site exempt from the permit? So I will probably qualify this question if it's an active railroad and allowing construction that's a more safety related between the construction and the active railroad. But if it's an inactive railroad, but designated railroad, I think it's a coordination with the railroad to suspend activities on the railroad during construction. Mm-hmm. So Allison, I think to answer your question, that will have to be a case-by-case basis if the construction site is more than 1 acre.
I mean, from my perspective, it's not too dissimilar from, say, like a Caltrans project where there's active drivers on the road and, they mark off a lane for construction. So, Allison, if there is construction within the railroad right of way, let's try saying that 3 times fast, and they are disturbing over 1 acre, they are not exempt from the permit. They would need to get permit coverage.
Hi there. So quick, I want to go back to the commingling of the groundwater and the rainwater. So if I have a groundwater permit on a site, open trench, I'm 27 feet deep, I have a lot of groundwater coming in, I get a minor rain event or a large rain event, and I'm using an ATS, a system to comply with the permit because I had priority pollutants out of, bounds. Mm-hmm. At that point, then I don't have to run it through my system. I can discharge it as stormwater if it meets turbidity and pH.
If it's groundwater,
it's a combo now.
If it's mixed, you would still have to comply with the requirements of the dewatering permit that's applicable.
The groundwater or the general construction permit?
The groundwater.
Okay. Yeah. I thought you said something different.
Oh, okay.
Before.
Yeah. No.
Right.
So to be clear, if there's commingling, you would typically go with the dewatering.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're, so this is gonna, I'm going to talk to you after this meeting. We've got a 6, 7, maybe 13-acre site that we're going to be dewatering, groundwater dewatering. So we have a dry surface to work on. So we're actively do have a dewatering permit, but it rains, the groundwater is suppressed. The surface is now stormwater, but we are in an active dewatering area. Can we treat that as stormwater? Or is it commingled?
The keyword is commingled, and most groundwater that is permitted has pollutants in it. So it mixes with the rainwater. You have to meet the effluent limitations of the general permit in order to discharge.
Side by side.
What do you mean by groundwater is suppressed? I mean that the excavation is dry. If the excavation is dry and there is no history of contaminants in the excavation, because most excavations at industrial site has solvents or things like that in it. So if there is none, then it would be treated like.
I would like to add to that, because when, at the construction site, you are familiar how deep is groundwater. So for instance, if groundwater is 10 feet below ground surface and you're excavating because you're constructing a subterranean parking, and it's actually excavating even below the groundwater level. So in this case, I would probably, depending on your documentation that you provided, you have a dewatering system that constantly dewater, the groundwater, because if the groundwater level is at 10 feet, but you're excavating down to 20 feet, there's actually, that zone there of 10 feet that's supposed to be occupied by groundwater. So, but you have a dewatering system that's constantly dewatering while you're putting your pavements and pylons, whatever. So if there is a commingling of stormwater and groundwater, and especially for sites that has been proven to be a site cleanup site or has a groundwater plume that is being dealt under environmental remediation, then that might trigger some requirement for dewatering, especially if you have that kind of site. I assume that you won't have that kind of site, but site conditions will tell.
Alrighty, we're coming up on 5 minutes left in the workshop. And so I did want to just answer one more question or two more questions quickly in the chat from Matt. If we are taking samples for total maximum daily loads, does the sample need to be sent to a certified lab? And Sarah answered, yes, it does. And one have 30 days to upload them to smarts if they are in compliance with the numeric action level or numeric effluent limitation. If they're not compliant, you have to submit that within 10 days. And then he followed up his question with, are we required to take a sample at every rain event or only when there is an expected exceedance? So if we're talking about the standard numeric action levels in the permit for pH and turbidity, you're required to take one sample from each actively discharging discharge location per day of qualifying precipitation event. If we are talking about the total maximum daily load sampling, you are only required to collect those samples when there has been the potential for that pollutant to be discharged off the site. And so that's based on your non-visible pollutant monitoring scheme that we have in the permit. Alrighty. And I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation again. Alrighty. So what's next? We have a few more additional workshops this summer. So this is the third out of, I believe, 11 workshops. The next one's tomorrow in Riverside. I think some of you will be joining me for that one as well. And I wanted to thank everyone here from Region 4 for joining me today and co-hosting this. What else is next? The 2022 CGP Reissuance Review, which is essentially the training deliverable that the CGP training team has been working on. That's actually being released this week. And what that does is it's used as part of the QSD QSP recertification process. And so for CASQA certified QSDs and QSPs, they have to complete this training before their certification expires in order to recertify, or they can do it when it expires in order to recertify. For the self-registered QSDs and QSPs, the professional engineers and geologists in SMARTS, they would go to SMARTS and essentially watch the same modules, but they won't have to take the quizzes as part of the training. And so it's about a 4-hour series of videos covering all sorts of topics like we did today in slightly more detail. We'll be providing updated mapping tools for both the TMDL implementation requirements and then for the risk determination process. I'm currently working on both the TMDL and the high risk receiving waters maps. So I'm trying to get those out in the next month or so as well. And I'll be kind of reviewing those at the CASQA quarterly. We also plan on preparing some guidance documents similar to the ones that we have available right now for SMARTS, and then just a frequently asked questions type document as well, using a lot of the questions that we received during these workshops, and post that on our website just to, better answer and disseminate information. And then lastly, kind of what we had a preview today was just the SMARTS NOI screens, but Matt is going to hold some virtual workshops later this year that can kind of go into depth and do maybe like a little tutorial of things like the ad hoc report and the annual report and the notice of termination later in the year. So stay tuned. And with that, here's my contact information. Matt already shared that as well. And feel free to ask any questions by sending me an email or giving me a phone call. Email's probably the better way to get my attention. And then I would always CC me in an email to the Stormwater Help Desk when you have a construction related topic. And that way it goes both to whoever. I don't work on Fridays. I have an RDO. So, Matt can help respond on Fridays, or I will get to it when I return to the office on Monday. So
We
thank you,
also
everyone.
have,
Oh.
sorry.
Go ahead.
We also have our contact information here. Feel free to grab on your way out. This is the Region 4 contacts.
Okay. I hope everyone found this workshop helpful. And really the main benefit is the question and answer session. I will be providing the same presentation at each of the workshops, but every region asks different questions, especially what pertains to some of the things in their region. Like Region 1 was very focused on Russell 2 because they have a lot of sediment TMDLs, whereas here we might be more focused on non-visible pollutant monitoring. And so I encourage you to, maybe listen to the other recordings once those are posted later this summer. So anyways, have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.